For this movement analysis, I had my roommate brush her hair. This is an activity of daily living under personal hygiene and grooming. This activity involves the use of the upper extremity from the glenohumeral joint down to the DIP joints of the digits. There are 4 phases that the individual completes throughout the movement that will contribute to the completion of the task. These phases include the preparatory phase, movement phase, follow-through phase, and recovery phase. I will now describe the preparatory phase and what specific movements occur at the joints on the right side of the body. This phase is considered the ready position phase and is when the body is generating the force, strength, and energy to complete the task. During the preparatory phase, my roommate is ready to engage and begins to approach the hairbrush that is resting on the countertop. During this phase, my roommate starts with her cervical spine slightly flexed at 5 degrees. As she begins to approach the hairbrush, the glenohumeral joint goes from 0 degrees to 25 degrees of flexion and remains in 0 degrees of adduction throughout. Her humeral ulnar and humeral radial joint starts flexed at 5 degrees and extends to 0 degrees. Her proximal and distal radial ulnar joint starts in a neutral position and then supinates 5 degrees. Her radial carpal joint starts in 5 degrees of extension and then flexes to 0 degrees. She also starts with 0 degrees of deviation and then ulnarly deviates 10 degrees when approaching the hairbrush. Her thumb CMC joint starts at 20 degrees of palmar abduction and increases to 25 degrees. The MCP joint starts in a neutral position of 0 degrees and then flexes 5 degrees. The IP joint starts in 5 degrees of flexion and then continues to 10 degrees as she approaches the hairbrush. Her index, middle, and ring fingers remain in flexion at all joints throughout this phase. The MCP for each of these digits starts in 5 degrees of flexion and increases to 40 degrees. The PIPs start at 70 degrees of flexion and increases to 90 degrees, and the DIPs remain in 5 degrees of flexion. Her small finger remains in flexion at all joints throughout this phase. The MCP starts in 5 degrees of flexion and increases to 50 degrees. The PIP starts in 40 degrees of flexion and increases to 90 degrees, and the DIP remains in 5 degrees of flexion. The next phase is the movement phase. This phase is when the execution of the task occurs and is a critical part of the overall motion. During the movement phase, my roommate picked up the hairbrush and brought it to her head and brushed through the length of her hair. My roommate's cervical spine was slightly flexed at 5 degrees, and as she looked up from the counter, she extended her neck back to 0 degrees. When she picks up the hairbrush and brings it off the counter and towards her head, her glenohumeral joint goes from 25 degrees of flexion to 85 degrees. After the hairbrush is brought to her head, the brush then goes downward and through the length of her hair. During this, the glenohumeral joint extends from 85 degrees of flexion to 0 degrees. The joint also remains in 0 degrees of adduction throughout this phase. Her humeral ulnar and humeral radial joint is extended to 0 degrees when grasping the hairbrush from the counter, but as the hairbrush is brought up towards her head, the joint flexes to 130 degrees. Her proximal and distal radial ulnar joint remains in 5 degrees of supination throughout the phase. Her radial carpal joint starts in a neutral position when picking up the hairbrush and then begins to extend by 40 degrees when she brushes through her hair. This joint also is in 10 degrees of ulnar deviation, and as the brush is picked up and brought towards the head, the wrist goes into a neutral position. When she brushes through her hair, her wrist is radially deviated by 15 degrees. Specific movements of the thumb and digit joints all occur as her hand goes from hovering over the brush to grasping the brush in her hand. Her thumb CMC joint is at 25 degrees of palmar abduction, but then palmarly adducts to 5 degrees. The MCP joint goes from 5 degrees of flexion to 0 degrees of extension. The IP joint remains in 10 degrees of flexion. Her index, middle, ring, and small fingers remain in flexion at all joints throughout this phase. The next phase is the follow-through phase. This phase is when the body segments prepare to complete the opposite motions and return to the preparatory phase. During this phase, my roommate is decelerating her movements as she brings the hairbrush back down to the counter. My roommate's cervical spine goes from 0 degrees of extension to 5 degrees of flexion as she looks down at where to place the hairbrush on the counter. The glenohumeral joint goes from 0 degrees of extension to 25 degrees of flexion as the upper extremity is reaching back towards the counter. The joint also remains in 0 degrees of adduction throughout this phase. Her humeral ulnar and humeral radial joint goes from being flexed at 130 degrees to extending to 0 degrees. When the hairbrush is initially out of her hair, the proximal and distal radial ulnar joint goes from 5 degrees of supination to 45 degrees of pronation. As the brush is being brought back down towards the counter, this joint supinates back to 5 degrees. Her radial carpal joint goes from 40 degrees of extension to 0 degrees of flexion, putting her wrist back into a neutral position. This joint also goes from 15 degrees of radial deviation to 5 degrees of ulnar deviation. The specific movements of the thumb and digit joints all occur as her hand is grasping the handle of the hairbrush. Her thumb CMC joint remains in 5 degrees of palmar abduction, the MCP joint remains in 0 degrees of extension, and the IP joint goes from 10 degrees of flexion to 15 degrees. Her index, middle, ring, and small fingers remain in flexion at all joints throughout this phase. The next phase is the recovery phase. This phase is when the body prepares to regain positioning and balance to allow for the motion to stop and another motion to occur. During this phase, my roommate releases the hairbrush onto the counter and brings her hand back down to her side. This is the original starting position and shows that she's balanced and prepared to start the next movement. My roommate's cervical spine extends bilaterally as she looks back up from the counter. The glenohumeral joint goes from 25 degrees of flexion to 0 degrees of extension and also remains in 0 degrees of adduction. Her humeral ulnar and humeral radial joint goes from being in 0 degrees of extension to being slightly flexed at 5 degrees. The proximal and distal radial ulnar joint goes from 5 degrees of supination to a neutral position. The radial carpal joint remains in a neutral position with 0 degrees of flexion and is ulnarly deviated by 5 degrees. The specific movements of the thumb and digit joints all occur as her hand releases the hairbrush handle and is being brought back down to her side. Her thumb CMC joint increases in palmar abduction to 25 degrees, the MCP joint slightly flexes to 5 degrees, and the IP joint extends from 15 degrees of flexion to 10 degrees of flexion. All of her digits extend into a lower degree of flexion at all joints throughout this phase. Digit extension occurs at the MCP, PIP, and DIP for the index, middle, ring, and small fingers.